Hi, welcome to First Geek Congregation. Today's topic is going to be, excuse me, I'm having somebody direct me in the background. Today's topic is in the beginning, which is actually a kind of a discussion of more than just Christian version of Genesis and or version of the creation story in Genesis, but also quite a few other religions. And there's a couple of good reasons why I want to pull them all up. And as usual, if you're watching this as a live event, you can message us on Facebook at facebook.com/firstgeekcongregation, and it will show up on my little phone, which is why you'll see me referencing it from time to time, or on Twitter at twitter.com/firstgeekcong, C-O-N-G, because congregation doesn't fit, unfortunately. In case you don't know, First Geek Congregation, we're kind of a little bit of, well, obviously we've got the word geek in there. We're geeky. We're mostly people who are, I'm not going to say fed with modern church or anything like that, but don't necessarily have a home that we enjoy nearly as much as we could, because geeks think different. We do things differently. We like things that other people don't, and we even like some things that some churches really don't like. For instance, Harry Potter. Some churches really have a problem with it. And the idea that a congregant would like it is foreign to some people. But we also look at things a little bit differently. It's love, peace, and respect. These are the things that are taught in the Bible. And how can we respect somebody unless we know about them? So a lot of times we fall into looking at other religions. And in this case, in the beginning, we're actually going to be looking at a good number of religions, ranging from some of the Native American traditions to Middle Eastern traditions on how did the world start?
I want to correct you, not traditions, beliefs.
Beliefs. Well, and I use the word traditions for a reason. And I'm not going to get to dive into it nearly as much as I like to, because you could teach an entire college course on this one topic. It's just an overview of what does all these religions view. And the reason why I say traditions is because there's more than one. Most of these have more than one creation story. Or the story changes over time. So the one that I picked for most of these is the most popular. For instance, Egyptian religion. You know, we all know everybody grew up kind of knowing a little bit about the Egyptian pantheon. There's not one creation myth. They have multiple. I believe there's 8. I've only got 4 of them on my list at the moment. So I picked tradition because it's the one that stands out. But that's not necessarily the only one or the first one for those groups. And there's some groups that I audited that they have so many stories, I don't know which one I would ever pick. Sumerian. I tried the very first one I tried to read, left me brain numb trying to understand it. It was really kind of bizarre from my Western mindset. But you have a good point. Faith versus tradition type thing. Especially because even when we get into because we're going to talk about these other religions and their views on, and we're going to talk about Genesis and how Christians treat Genesis, both the literalism and the allegory versions of the stories, and why it matters to a degree and why it doesn't matter, because that's the best example actually of what all these other religions have when it comes to the tradition. Because if you are Lutheran, tell me, in Lutheranism, is it literal or is it an allegory?
Allegory.
So in some Christian faiths, it is literal. It was 6 days of creation, etc., etc., etc. But we'll get into that in a minute. Actually, more than a minute. In case you don't know, we're held at the Center of Wichita. The Center of Wichita is an LGBT
QAA.
Yes, thank you. I was missing some letters there. If you don't know what LGBTQIA means, look it up sometime. It's actually more interesting than you might expect. But we're held at the Center of Wichita in our nice little room. The big room is almost done. And once the big room's done, we'll move over there. We'll have a projector, and we'll have all sorts of cool technology hooked up, and multiple ways for us to fail with that technology, since we often have technology problems when getting started there some weeks. This week, though, is a little bit strange because we don't have an audience. I have me and I have her. And that's all that's in here. So if you're online watching, feel free to ask all the questions you want to, because for once we're not going to have a whole, well, I don't know. I don't know how much discussion we'll have. She's going to ask a lot of questions, trust me. She's good at that. So if she senses that I'm floundering because I've run out of material, she will jump, I'm sure. But so what?
Are you going to talk about Darwin?
No, oddly enough, I'm not going to talk about Darwin at all. Because I'm going very specifically for the creation stories rather than getting into evolution. Darwin and creation, it's not synonymous. He's synonymous with the idea of the evolution of the species, but not so much with the how did we come to be, as in the creation of the universe or the world or the first man.
Well, because I must argue with you.
But
when Charles Darwin first had a lot of his ideas, it was considered blasphemy. It was in his own life, even with his relationship with his wife. She was a devout Christian of the Church of England, and he was committing blasphemy.
Here's an interesting factoid right there. We're going to come back to it. It was considered blasphemy in the church that he attended.
Right. That's not in the greater church at whole. I understand.
Because there was the difference between the Church of England and the Catholic Church when it comes to
and every other church in the world. But
yes.
I'm making a point.
Mm-hmm.
So as a point, when you have a thought that is appears counter to the standard tradition / belief, does that start a new tradition?
It can.
Because, as of note, Darwin had a theory of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to tell Mr. Ham that, but it's a theory of evolution. Actually, I wouldn't hate it at all. But
No. Actually, he used that whole thing that it's just a theory. That it's just a theory. There's not really any truth to it. It's just a theory. That's what Ken Ham went after very specifically.
Right.
And I lost my marker.
Yeah, watch how you're leaving.
Hi, how you doing out there? Where the heck did it go?
I don't know. You threw it.
Wow. Well, I didn't throw it. I dropped it.
Well, it tossed forth the room.
Through it. I probably would have been able to find it easier.
Anyway, so I'm just making a point that when you start having beliefs that are counter or perceived to be counter from, I'm not even going to say house of worship, from your community. Charles and his wife had a long, many-year discussion over whether or not he was going to go to hell.
Yeah.
But she still loved him. But was she going to go to hell for loving a man who wasn't Christian when they got married in the Christian church? So there was a lot of things there about how society will treat you if you think outside of your community.
Sure. And I'm going to come back to the Christian side of things and Darwin. Darwin, we're not going to cover, per se. We are going to mention him, though. We're going to mention him. By the way, I want to say hi to Kaylin. Kaylin has been Kaylin has been trying for a very long time to be able to watch these live, but his laptop has failed him many times. And that was one of the messages we got, was that Kaylin is joining us remotely. So hi, Kaylin. Feel free to ask any questions. And I never finished my spiel at the beginning. Because we went off topic. We're at the Center of Wichita. To find out more about the Center of Wichita, thecenterofwichita.org. And the reason why I mention these guys, because they're fantastic. They give the LGBTQIA community someplace to be. They have team groups. They have a number of things, and they're building this. This is one room of it. There's actually four rooms grand total. This is one of the smaller ones, and they're still under construction. They could still use some help. So if you get a chance, take a look at their website. Maybe consider send them a donation or something to help them kind of get this down the road. And of course, it benefits First Gate congregation too, because eventually we're going to be in the other room where the projector is and all the cool stuff. So, plus, like I said, they're just good people. All right, actually launching into this. We, as Westerners, have a very specific idea of what creation means. all creation myths in our mind starts with nothing. I can't spell that. Starts with nothing, and then something happens. It's a very specific type of story. And you'll notice something. I don't use the term creation myth for any of these because myth in Western society means fairy tale. It means something that's not true. It means something that has very little meaning or value overall. These tales, though, these stories, they are all true to their religion. Obviously, well, one could say they can't all be true at the same time. There was a show I watched one time on the Bible, and somebody presented the idea, what if the Bible isn't real? What if none of this is real? What if this was all a fabrication? And the guy looks at the screen, and he said something I thought was so fantastic. He said, it's still truth, even if it's just a story. And in each one of these tales that we're going to talk about, each one of these is true in that religion, and there's some reason why these exist. Some of them, I'll be honest, some of them I don't get. In fact, when I was studying for this, and this is part of my joy of doing First Geek Congregation, is getting to study the heck out of a topic. Originally, when I was going to college, I wanted to be an archaeology and anthropology major. I got the opportunity to do some great things in life, so I didn't get to finish college. So getting to do this is the type of stuff I would have been studying in anthropology or would have been studying in theology classes. So, Exonillo.
Exonillo or Exnillo?
Nillo.
Okay.
And I misspelled it. See, I did it from memory and I was wrong. H-I-L-O. Exnillo. From nothing. That is our creation story in Genesis, is from nothing. It came about, there had been nothing.
Like Greek or Latin?
Latin, I believe.
Okay.
I believe it's Latin. I don't know for sure. But this isn't the only type of tale. Actually, there's 5 major types. Creation from chaos. Chaos is actually a very specific thing.
Yeah, in Cosmos, it's a very specific thing.
Sometimes it's considered to be a fog. Sometimes it's considered to be a mist. Sometimes it's considered to be nothing. Now, when I say nothing, though, not nothing like non-existence of the universe, it is that it was without form. Christian story kind of almost crosses into it to a certain degree because of the mention of the void, and it was without form. It's kind of similar in a way, but it's not the same thing overall. Earth diver. Earth diver is you have these things up here, and they come down here, and they do something, and they go back. Now, again, this is kind of interesting because we're talking about the Christian portion. You do have a certain amount of earth diver appearance in Christianity as God comes down.
Genesis 1:2 is much more chaos rather than Nillo. It's now the earth was unformed and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep.
Yeah, I know, but for some reason it's Exonillo. I'm telling you.
According to who?
And they got these guys. They're supposed to be smart on this stuff.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're right.
Fair point.
I can read right in front of me. I can even read enough of the Hebrew. Chaos.
Emergence. And humanity emerges from another world. So we come from somewhere else, and then we're here. Everything is created in the process, usually.
Alien.
Fair point. Bring about what my father tends to view humanity as. And finally, the world parent. World parent falls in the category, well, I think everybody can kind of guess what this comes from. Two deities get together, a little wine, a little romance, suddenly have an earth. If you think I'm joking on this, I'm not.
Greeks.
Some of them are quite like that.
The Greek theory. Mother Gaia.
Mother Gaia, yes. Mother Gaia and Uranus get together and they produce Titans. We'll get into the Greeks here in a bit. But I wanted to kind of cover that these all stories have a major type. Because just like any other type of tale, there's only so many ways it can be told. There's only so many original thought patterns. The rest of it becomes details. So if you think for a minute, hey, wow, that sounds a lot like this other one. Well, they do. To a certain degree, they do. And the very first one I'm going to cover is going to make you think at first, oh, they're all the same. But they ain't. I forgot to grab me a
Eraser.
eraser.
They ain't.
They ain't. Ain't a word, right? Except for when it's in the dictionary.
Ain't is bad English. I wouldn't say it wasn't a word.
And this particular piece is part of the reason why I was up very late last night. I have a friend who is very much into the Native American tradition, because he is Native American, but he's also an anthropologist.
And a
sociologist. So it's interesting to talk to him because he can talk about it from a religious standpoint, and then he can step aside and he can talk about it from an academic standpoint. Same topic, two different views. So when I asked him a question, and particularly I asked him because I started studying the Native American ones, and went, well, this kind of sounds similar. Because Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and two others. Basically what's often referred to as the 5 civilized tribes. I'm just going to read just a little bit of this. Just the very beginning of it so that you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. Okay. At the beginning, there was a great mound. It was called Naya. Okay, I don't speak Native American tongues, so you'll have to forgive me on that. From this mound was the Creator fashioned the first of the people. The people crawled through the long, dark cave into daylight and became the first Choctaw. Now, first off, the first thing that you notice is that there's a phase missing from this. There's no talk about the creation of the earth. Second of all, this is more of an emergence style where they were created one place and then they became by traveling through the... Now, the problem with what I've got here, all of my notes is just one view of each one of these creation stories. So somebody out there goes, excuse me, but actually it's, keep in mind, I can only present so many views without this turning into an entire college course on it, which I'm not qualified to teach anyways. So there's Choctaw. Well, Cherokee. The Earth describes the Earth as a great floating island surrounded by seawater. It hangs in the sky by cords attached from the 4 cardinal points. The story tells that the first Earth came to be when Beaver's grandchild, the little water beetle, came to the sky realm to see what was below the water. He scurried over the surface of the water, but found no solid place to rest. He dived to the bottom of the water and brought up some soft mud. The mud expanded in every direction and became the earth. So you got two pieces that happened here. And yes, you got that look on your face. What? Yes. Okay, so he grabs some mud, comes up with the mud, and the mud becomes the earth.
That's not the problem I had with it. Beaver's grandchild is a water beetle.
Okay, you realize
Why isn't Beaver's grandchild a beaver?
If this is your sticking point, you're in so much trouble if I actually talk about the Sumerian one. Um,
No, bringing up mud from the deep it's not illogical. Was it day 2?
Yeah. But part of the thing here is that you notice that some things were required to exist before existence comes into existence.
Yeah, because there was beaver and there was a water beetle and there was something suspended on cords.
Yeah, in the water. And in the earth, as it mentions, belief describes the earth as a great floating island surrounded by seawater. Earth meaning a mountain, not earth as in this.
Because not terra firma, but...
Right. Now,
dirt.
So the problem is all this wet mud everywhere. So now you need to have some way of finding when the earth is done. So Buzzard goes down and Buzzard checks it out. So Buzzard, as he's flying around, he gets a little tired, and where he flaps low across the land, it causes great wind and forms the mountains and the valleys.
Sure, works for me.
When everything finally dried, and there's other various animals, by the way, that looked at this. When it finally dried, you ended up with the earth. Their story also gets into why the animals have certain characteristics and things like this. I won't get into that because it's really... My friend told me all about it. It's kind of mind melting. Again, from a Western mentality, it's a little mind melting because we don't think in such terms. We think of animals as being fairly powerless unless we have given them power. There are pagan traditions, pagan new traditions, which do that. But in native thinking, these things existed first. Then the story of creation isn't so much about the creation of Earth as it becomes about the creation of mankind. I forgot to drop one of them on here. Shoot. Oh, I have to add this. Because no matter how weird you think some of these stories are, there always is a chance for them to get weirder. And Cherokee, this last little bit of the Cherokee one, which all my notes are huge chunks of story that have been pasted on here. The first people were a brother and sister. Once the brother hit his sister with a fish and told her to multiply. Following this, she gave birth to a child every 7 days, and soon there were too many people, so women were forced to have just one child every year. I'm trying to figure out the connection between hitting the sister with a fish and telling her to multiply, how that works out. One of the reasons why I think that it was so fun is because it points out something to us. It's out of context. We don't have the cultural context for these stories. If I had, say, an expert in the subject who I happen to know, who told me half this stuff, come here and talk about it, he could give us the context, which would make much more sense.
Well, I know some traditions, women have children that doesn't have anything to do with men.
Yeah.
Thus, your ending piece with that with being, instead of having one every 7 days, they have one every year, implying that she did something to get pregnant. But what if you didn't? What if you couldn't have one every year? Did that mean you were lesser? What if you happen to have two in the same calendar year? Does that make you more awesome? There's a lot to be said about the sanctity of the woman in some different Native American traditions. There was even one that my dear friend Brent had shared about if a woman is in her moon, she's not allowed into the sweat lodge because she's too powerful.
Yes.
Not that she's PMS crazy, she's too powerful.
I think it means the same thing. No, yeah. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Well, but it was very interesting so that there was a reference point to that she was doing something special rather than being a freak of nature like most of the white people treat us.
Yes.
So that origin myth definitely does offer that there's something special about a woman specifically, that she has capabilities outside of a man.
Well, and you have to remember, some of those were matriarchal societies too.
Yes, so well, that's kind of the point I'm making.
Yeah.
I'm getting there. I just don't like to use the $5 words.
I use them.
Matriarchal women are special too. Same amount of syllables.
Well, I'll debate your definition. It's not that women are special to a matriarchal society. Women
are specialer.
Yes. We're all special, but some are a little more special than others. So yes, and the third one I had on there was Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek. Creek ended up being very much very similar. So you start with the idea, the existence of an island or a thing in the mud or in the water, and then the mud is brought up, and the creation is from the mud. Well, Creek went a little bit differently with theirs, though, because it sounds like there's just parallels, but they're really only the same starting point. Because with the Creek, mankind was created from the mud, but the mud was not strong, so it crumbled. Mankind was then created from wood, but the wood had no soul and didn't mind. So they flooded the humans. And then humanity was finally created from, and I wish I had it on here. I don't remember what the third final thing mankind was created from. Yeah, I know. It's kind of like saying, hey, I got a good joke, and forgetting the punchline. But the point being, they started in a similar area. By the way, you'll notice none of them talk about the creation of that mound in the water. Where did all that come from? They don't talk about that. Not in the versions that I have. Now, oddly enough, there are other versions where almost all of those start with the sky gods. The sky gods come down and create that mound. That mound, by the way, is a place. It's on a map. It's in Missouri, Mississippi.
Which religion?
Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and the other two that I can't remember that are the five tribes, five civilized tribes. That place, to a certain extent, it exists, and you can find it. Now you say, notice I say to a certain extent, because it gets weirder than that. Just because a place exists here does not mean it's what it was. So really weird. Okay, let's flip over since we're in the Americas. Let's go with the Mayans. Mayans.
For all of you who don't know at home, the Mayans were the Mexico, not the Incas.
Thank you. You're right. A lot of people confuse those.
Yes.
You had two gods that were the creators. The two gods decided to preserve their legacy by creating an earthbound species looking like them. I messed up. I don't say that often, but I messed up. The Mayans are the one that have created out of clay, created out of wood, created out of something else. The final one, they were created out of maize.
Which is corn here in America.
Yes.
Did you know America is the only place that calls that particular thing corn?
I don't understand why.
Because corn in England is barley corn. It's wheat. Anyway.
How confusing. So I'm sorry, I actually messed that up. That was the Mayans I was talking about, not the Creek. Um, anyways, but with them, they created them from mud. There was no island in the ocean or anything like that. In fact, there's not a whole lot of talk about where the earth comes from. And this is one of the things. A lot of these religions don't find it important. What does it matter where the earth comes from? It's more important about where we come from, which is kind of interesting. Is it important? It becomes a good question.
Most cosmologists think that it makes a whole lot of difference.
Well, yes. You know, if your job is to find out how the universe was created, they're going to find it to be very, very important.
And to be clear, because I stumbled, cosmologist, not cosmetologist.
Greek. You seem to have part of that one already.
Did I tell you I took a myth class in college, and we started with the creation, and we were supposed to read Genesis chapter 3 as if it weren't true?
Oh, fun!
As well as going over various other Greek and Latin, and then some Aboriginal creation stories by one of the best professors I ever had in my life.
Very cool.
So
I wish I had that opportunity.
The recall button's a little broke, but I got some basics.
So, okay. Because when I was growing up and we studied Greek mythology, where we started was with Kronos. So that's what I knew of Greek mythology. Basically, you start with Kronos and you work your way out. But that's not where it actually starts. I did not know this until I started studying this time. And you might take this as being again, going with that whole tradition thing, this is the most accepted version of the story, not necessarily the only version of the story. Basically, it begins with nothing. It begins with chaos.
With a capital C.
With a capital C. And out of that comes Gaia. Now, there's nothing about the creation of Gaia in what I was reading. Just Gaia emerged from this. Along with Eros and the Abyss and Erebus, excuse me. Gaia then gave birth to Uranus. Now, you're probably thinking the planet, no. Uranus, the sky. It was the sky god. Then this...
There's another A. I wasn't spelling Gaia right, and my wiki was failing me. Gaia has 2 A's.
G-A-I-A.
Yeah.
Then Uranus turned around and fertilized Gaia after having been created by Gaia. From there was the Titans, the first 6 male Titans and the 6 female Titans. After that, there was to be no more Titans born. So then they started having the Cyclopses and a number of other ones. You'll notice, again, nothing really happened. Earth just came to be. And it was everything else that slowly but surely cascaded down until eventually we get to the point that that humans are created. So again, it's another society that didn't care so much about where did the universe come from. Okay, that's not important. Where did we come from? That's what was important. Egyptians. Do I want to do Egyptians right now or not?
Yes, because you already said it.
Man, these are long. There's not really a good way of abbreviating this. The thing with the Egyptians was that there was multiple creation stories depending on which group you were dealing with. So, for instance, Hermopolis. The creation, let's see, in the city of Hermopolis, focused on the nature of the universe before the creation of the world. Basically boils down to there was pretty primeval water, which was represented by the 8 gods. God Nu and his female counterpart Na'et represented the inert primeval water itself, Hu and his counterpart Hu-Het represented the water's infinite extent. Kuk and Ka-Et personified the darkness present within it. Amun and Amunet represented its hidden and unknowable nature, in contrast to the tangible world of the living. The waters themselves were set apart in the creation, were part of the creation process, and therefore the deities representing them could be seen as the creator gods. So basically, it boils down to, for the creation of the earth and the creation and eventual creation of mankind, it took 8 gods to get to that point, because each one of them represents certain things, and they're brought together. They were originally divided male and female, but eventually it changes.
I'm going to pause you for a second.
Sure.
Going off of that basis, can you imagine what Pharaoh thought of the Israelites and their one God?
Monotheism was pretty rare at that point. Not unheard of, but rare. The Egyptians had...
rather a rhetorical question, but...
Well, yeah. But I was going to point out, in reference to that, there had already been a monotheistic god cult. It was a female god, I can't remember her name. They disliked this concept, because this is why it's important to say this. They disliked this concept to the point that when, keep in mind the Egyptians, you had gods and you had living gods. And you had living people who were the embodiment of eternal gods. Very different sort of thinking. So when this god had been conquered, it wasn't just a matter of, oh, it's passed back into the even not even cast into Tartarus. This god no longer exists. They wiped almost all trace of this god out. So the idea of a monotheistic god showing up again.
Well, I guess I was thinking more on a personal level, because Joseph and Pharaoh were friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
To a point. It took 400 years, or ish. We'll say 300 because it doesn't say when. But when there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. So Joseph and Pharaoh were friends.
Yeah.
And then he brought along his family to live in the Egyptian land that had absolutely just, I don't even want to say counterculture, because that would be there was some comparison. The Israelites were not farmers, they were herders, whereas the Egyptians were more farmers.
Yeah.
So completely and absolute different lifestyles, down to how many gods you worshipped.
Yeah.
But they were friends. It was a personal level, not just two societies trying to accommodate each other. It was two buddies that, even for all that, brought kindness from Pharaoh, but did not convert him.
Yeah.
But at the time, it wasn't needed that he was converted. He wasn't a jerk. Therefore, proof that you can live as friends.
Yes.
And have completely different ideological systems. But that always fascinated me in a personal level. That here is Pharaoh, the embodiment of his God, and here's Bob, who happened to have good dreams or accurate dreams, and they managed to be friends and keep company. I mean, not just, yeah, well, he helped me out, so I'll let him have something. No, they kept company for the rest of Joseph's life.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a couple of extra points in on there. Talking about the fact that they're friends is kind of interesting. People forget that modern day, there's not a whole lot of differentiation. If somebody owns cattle, they're not particularly unfriendly with people who grow wheat. There's no reason to be in modern society. However, back then, particularly sheep, you probably know tales of how much sheep farmers were disliked. Because sheep, they'll eat grass all the way to the root. They don't just graze, they eat it all the way down. So will goats too.
Sheep and goats, and they had cattle.
And cattle, on the other hand, tend to graze to a flat point. They won't tear stuff up out of the ground, so you don't destroy it. The problem is, so back in an era where there was no fences, in fact, there was no territories were a little more nebulous.
That's why you had shepherds.
So it wasn't unheard of for somebody who has 500 sheep to accidentally get their sheep to go through Bob's grain. Which means just completely the destruction of a harvest for a year. And Cain and Abel also kind of shows this tale, but we don't ever think about it. There was at the time period an inherent dislike between the two, because those that grazed their animals, and particularly if they did it on large swaths, often ran afoul of those who were farmers instead.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said about the entire lifestyle, because as running herds, you're much more easy to be migrants. Whereas if you've planted something, you must stay.
Yes.
Which I think there's a big, huge allegory there with Christianity. But there's something to be said about the different bodies living together. Because once you plant grain, if you just let the rain be the water, then you can go on about other things until it's harvest time.
Sure.
Whereas if you have livestock, you have to at least have, if you can't shepherd them, you have to have shepherds.
Yes.
So having more servants usually came about, and that caused a lot of class and society opportunities. But that was more of a day-to-day task, very specifically. You always had to make sure they had food and water. Whereas with the grain, once it was planted, then unless you were trying to figure out some aqueduct system, you just kind of went with it until it was...
You also weeded and a couple of things like that, which again, is another thing, modern idea. Well, weeding, how hard to be a wheat field? I mean, there's only 6 little things that grow up, and there you just get rid of them. We didn't have pesticides back then. We didn't have seed selection. We didn't have all these things.
Being completely different. Yeah, but just very different lifestyles.
Yes,
and especially because often a shepherd would just have to show up and try to stay awake. Whereas if you were pulling weeds, yeah, you get the short people to do that because you'll break your back.
Actually, they had a tool for it.
I know, but even before tools.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be said, and even on your point of Cain and Abel, how much did I always get mixed up? Vegetable grower, how much effort did he actually put forth?
Yeah.
Versus that being God made the vegetables grow, versus a sheep, how much effort did he put forth versus God letting the sheep grow?
Yeah.
There's a lot to be said about that. And so there's been cultural angst since almost the dawn of time. But yeah, so yeah, definitely dealing with having with Pharaoh's culture having set A and then bringing in set B and everybody getting along with it and prospering. Both Egypt and the Israelites grew and prospered. 75 went in and 3 million came out. I mean, they obviously had plenty of leisure time. But
something to throw in there, though, when it comes to the being accepted and everything, and I'm moving it along for a moment for a reason. Like the creation stories that I mentioned where the Egyptians had multiple stories, they also did have regional gods. which we talked about Baals and things like that before. In particular, though, it would not have been abnormal. A monotheistic god would have been odd to bring in. But for somebody to bring their idols and their gods with them, hey, if Joe, who is from 200 miles over, just keep in mind that's a fairly long distance, from 200 miles over, comes over and lives with you, he probably got a sack of idols, and he brought some of his own traditions and his own stuff. And there was so much, I'm not going to say there was no animosity that occurred. There was. But from what I understand, obviously I was not there. I'm not that old. But from my understanding, though, there was a level of acceptance of the idea of this guy over here brought his god's big deal. The idea that you brought a god that, one, was monotheistic and, two, had no idols. How weird is that? That would be a little different for them. There wasn't a whole lot of that sort of thinking that happened, because even the Egyptian monotheistic god that I mentioned, whose name escapes me entirely, because I was not prepared for that particular thing, there were still shrines and things like this and idols involved in it.
Right.
So.
And speaking of, yes, there was no idols, but they still did the sacrifices, and lambs and cattle were considered sacred to the Egyptians, which, when you get to the Moses story, that was one of the biggest reasons he wanted to go, was because the neighbors were intolerant of them slaughtering lambs.
They were going to have to go out to do this.
Yes.
And that was their kind of excuse.
That was the opening excuse.
Yeah.
But there was quite a problem with that practicing their religion in that way did upset the neighbors by this time.
Yeah.
So it had grown from a tolerance into racial intolerance, and then ideological intolerance that cost a lot of people their lives, one way or the other.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of lessons to be learned. As soon as it starts being, well, you're not like me, and then therefore your ideas are also wrong, it can get into quite an interesting little pickle. So just...
heck, you know what? I'm going to skip the rest of the Egyptians. I'm going to skip, because we're going to get into one of those that your ideas are not like me, therefore there's something wrong with you.
Yes.
What group would I be talking about?
Christians?
No. Actually, I'm thinking a little different one. Islam. Islam's creation story, which follows very closely with the biblical one. Notice I said closely.
Yeah.
In fact, they have a debate. It's either 6 or 8 days of creation. It's how long it took to make the mountains. It took 2 days to create the mountains. But whether or not it fell within those 2 days occurred concurrently with the existing 6 days, or whether it fell separately. From what I understand, not being an expert, from what I understand, it more falls on the 6 days. Oh, but there's another thing. I'm using the wrong term. I keep saying days.
Nights.
No.
Divisions.
See, the word that they have is day-ish or separation. There's no, if instead of separation.
Even in Genesis, it says, hold on, let me bring up the exact quote. Genesis 1:4. Blah, 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 and God divided the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Could very easily be
one division.
A division.
Yeah, especially because if you go with the term division, suddenly you lose all time frame, because that their divisions could mean epochs.
Right. I do wonder what Yom is the Hebrew day, but does it mean day or does it mean separation or division?
Actually, if I remember,
I don't know enough Proto-Hebrew.
I remember right, you're bringing up something I hadn't thought about. If I remember right, you may be correct in thinking that it was division, that it could be defined as division. And now I have to look.
I'm going to make you Google.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But Yom is still what they use in Israel today. It's Yom Rishon, day the first, rather than any other descriptors like Monday being the day of the moon. They don't do that. It's just day the first.
Those who argue day means long age point out that the word Hebrew, the Hebrew word Yom, can have a number of meanings, only one of which is day of 24 hours. They further seek to strengthen their position with the use of Psalms 94, which is a day is 1,000 years as a day is 1,000 years, and for God, and 2 Peter 3:8, which is equivalent. Peter was actually paraphrasing Psalms for it, but it was as a moment rather than as a day. Comparing days 1,000 years. Both verses, however, are simply using figures of speech, similes, to show that God is not constrained by the time.
So this goes back into the argument discussion, Big Bang versus God. It says that the world was created in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Who's to say how long a yom was?
Mm-hmm.
What if it wasn't 24 hours? We can now currently calculate the measure of the sun, well, the Earth's revolution slowing down. We have instruments that can measure that. So why wouldn't it have been 22-hour day back then?
And by the way, I'm going to...
Or 1,000 years, because God can change all that in a heartbeat. So
I'm going to finish this real quick, Block. It is recognized, of course, that the word day can be used in a number of variations. It has any of 5 meanings: a period of light, a period of 24 hours, a general vague time, a point of time, or a year, oddly enough.
back in my day.
The context determines, that's actually becomes a very interesting phrase at that point. The context determines which of these is intended by the writer. By the way, English has 14 different definitions for day, actually. We think of day most of the time during a conversation like this as being 24 hours. Actually, we do have a number of other definitions.
Well, and we say things like back in my day, we mean back when we were younger.
Yes.
But even when we talk about the days of yore or the olden days, we don't say the olden years or anything like that. We speak of glory days or heydays or salad days. We don't, oftentimes we mean much more than one 24-hour period or even several 24-hour periods. It's more like a month or a year. But it is prevalent to our colloquialism that we mean a time frame rather than a specific
Absolutely.
value day.
One of these days. Doesn't necessarily mean a specific date or a specific timing or a
That's what needs to be printed on the other side of the round too.
One of these days. Anyways.
Anyway, back into
So,
your 6 divisions.
But otherwise, they have the 6 divisions, which, like I said, could be epochs or it could be days. General thinking is that, again, I'm saying general, I'm generalizing, because it has changed over time. General thinking, though, is that it is not days, it is divisions, and those divisions are not specifically defined. And they are, keep it in mind, from the time period and folks that we're talking about, they were science-minded a little bit before some of the rest of us were. So it's important to understand they already had some flexibility in their thought, rather than being literalists.
I have a question about what you just said about science-minded before the rest of us. I would say the Middle East as a whole was science-minded before the rest of us, because even there's some evidence that even in Moses' day, they could follow the stars and know which direction they were going.
Star charting was important, and particularly it was interesting that you're right. Star charting was important, being able to navigate by the stars, but was actually kind of an oddity for land-based groups.
Right.
Because typically this was only important if you were at sea. Those that were seafaring cultures were big on it.
When Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years, yeah, they were following the column of fire and cloud, but they knew where they were. There was indicators. When they built the tabernacle, they were able to use hard measurements, and they knew how to make alloys. So I would just say, if you're going to say that, I would say the Middle East. And that's heard more about science before.
And that's actually a good point, because a lot of times when I talk about Christianity, I usually am thinking about the Roman-influenced Christianity that occurs after the time of Jesus, which has a different mindset.
Yes. But anyway, I know one small little point I want to ask you, because I don't know the answer, so you might have to Google it. When you're talking about Islam, how much Islam was there before Muhammad?
No. There's not.
Okay.
I could be misspeaking.
Well, I bring this up because Muhammad was what?
500.
500?
Roughly
500 years past the Jewish Messiah. Which, that hurts some people's brains, I know. But 500 years past Christ. Okay. Who's to say which is the older religion? Because this might have changed its name. Jesus was not a Jew. He was a Judean who was Hebrew. Some playing with words. The Greeks didn't know how to make it work out better, so if you're from Judea, you were a Jew. It just worked for them. So there was a lot to be lost in the language translation. So if there's a 500-year time gap, think about how many different cultures those who practice Islam would have encountered. The difference between Moses and Muhammad being 2,000 years. A whole lot of cultural things have happened. Yeah?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm actually...
No, I know you're Googling. So, who's to say what did and did not influence one of the other's storytelling? If you ever try to get at Aboriginal tales, a lot of them have some sort of influence of monotheism because nobody wrote them down until after the Christians came. So when you're trying to come up with a word, you don't know what it is, you're going to call it this. Yeah. Jabberwocky. Somebody made up a word because they didn't know how else to describe this creature.
I'm going to rescind my answer, but I'm not going to give an answer or response. Because actually, it'd be like asking, when does Christianity start? Does it begin with Jesus, or does it begin with the Bible? It begins with Jesus, would be my opinion.
Yeah, I was going to say it depends which Christian you ask.
Right. Same thing applies to the answer to the question you asked, specifically because it's used as part of the same text. So, depending on how you're looking at it, it either actually begins with Muhammad's birth, begins with Muhammad's life as the prophet, or begins with... So, there's not an easy answer to that. It's not as cut and dry as I thought it was.
Yeah, well, I knew that. That's why I asked you. I knew it wasn't cut and dry. That's why I don't know the answer. But if you're going, even if you go as far back as Ishmael and then follow his life forward as being the other path, there's still a lot to be said for who practiced this lifestyle before Muhammad.
And I don't have enough history. Now, the word Islam and the word Muslim already existed. Islam meant to surrender, and meant to surrender, meaning somebody who meaning to I'm not sure how to
Not be
describe
stubborn.
I'm gonna have to look it up. But not surrender as in white flag. No, no, no. Muslim meant one who surrenders to God. So it's very specific.
In Arabic.
In Arabic. Well, sort of Arabic.
Well,
keep in mind how old the languages in the area are.
Right.
Because it's like asking, was it Aramaic? Which one?
Well, I was just, I didn't know it could have been Farsi or some of the other ones too. I don't know.
I don't know how far back it dates. I really don't.
One could make argument that just because Mecca is in Saudi Arabia, apparently somebody think that particular piece of rock in Jerusalem is important too. So there's a lot to be said about who and why and where.
Yeah. And the rest of the story, after the 6 divisions, etc., you still have Adam and Eve. You still follow a very it's not exactly the same. I'm not going to say they're the same exact story. They are not. There's slight differences here and there on who's involved in what until you get up to Abraham. That's where the branch occurs.
And then Ishmael was the chosen son.
Yes. And then after that, all bets are off because you have people who appear in both religions, but not necessarily
very different characters.
Well, some of them yes, and some of them no. Jesus is not a very different character when it comes to what the man did.
Sure.
Just whether or not he was chosen was an incarnation of God or not. That's majorly different.
Right.
Very important guy. Son of God.
Right.
It depends differently. But
well, even Muhammad wasn't supposed to be the son of God, was he? He was the prophet.
He's a prophet. So, and he was the prophet. Prophet.
Does Islam have a Messiah figure? A Christos?
Yes. Yes. And I can't answer that properly, though.
Okay.
Because I know the answer that's popping into my head, and I know it's not right.
Okay.
But the answer is
from
yes.
what I've been able to gather, they seem to be very centered on one's personal relationship with God.
Yes.
Allah.
More like the Jewish mindset of
right.
We're not worried about an intermediary. It's me and him.
Right. So therefore, upon saying that, are they awaiting, or do they recognize Muhammad as being the answer in which they seek? I'm digressing off of your entire subject, but anyway, but yeah, no, the first several chapters of Genesis are very similar to those in the Quran. I mean, there's several people I would hate to tell that to because I think they might hit me, but
well, we have to understand, and this is one of the frustrations I have with the Middle East, is that we are brother faiths.
Oh yeah.
And there are reasons in the Christian and in the Jewish Bible, we'll go with in Torah, for killing Muslims, and there are reasons in the Quran for killing Jews. However, you have to choose those as the reason. It's not the only path. They are supposed to be a religion of peace. Same as Christianity is supposed to be a religion of peace. There's a reason why both of them are supposed to be religions of peace, by the way, and why it's ignored. But they're brother faiths. They shouldn't have so much problem getting along. It's everybody else that causes them.
Well, and there's a lot to be said for that there, Cookie. You grew up with kind of sort of siblings, and I grew up with very much a sibling. It is very common for siblings to try to kill each other, literally and figuratively. We all understand Pugsley Wednesday. There's, even if it's not strife, it's still a division. Not always, but it is awkward, especially if the parent, in this case God, has to choose which child do I love more. Sometimes my mother has said, "You two figure it out," and make sure there wasn't any knives handy. But just you have to appreciate how Freud uses the term sibling rivalry. I hate that term. How to get along, even though you think differently, but you're in the exact same circumstances. It's hot and there's no water. I can blame the other guy.
Yeah.
And therefore my God will offer favors upon me.
Yeah.
Or if he doesn't offer favors upon me, apparently I didn't blame the right guy. I didn't blame the Bob over there. There's a lot to be said about similar circumstances and trying to come out on top, whatever that means to you. In some of the Japanese cultures, coming out on top might mean dying.
Yeah.
If you die in an honorable way.
Let's not bring Shinto into this.
Yeah, well,
Brent and I discussed Shinto last night.
But I'm just saying, we think that coming out on top means that you live. Like, well, what if your goal is heaven? Why do we try to preserve life? Mm-hmm. There's a whole lot to be said about that. Unless you're just really not sure about the raisins and virgins issue. Because the raisins would not be a reward for me.
I like raisins. Not as much as virgins, but I like raisins.
What if there's only 72 of them? What do you happen to eat them all?
Yeah, it never specifies that they're not regenerative or anything like that.
They also never specifies you're supposed to eat them either.
Sure. Oh, look, raisins.
Now
what?
But there's a lot to be said about if there's enough water for two people and I have two kids and you have two kids, which one of them suddenly doesn't wake up in the morning? Even if it's not yourself,
yeah.
It is your procreation efforts. It's hot and there's no water. That's still the best argument I've ever heard of why they keep having strife.
Yeah.
And of course, keep in mind the ones we hear on the news are the crazy ones. Then there's the other 99% who aren't. And even for that, the
ISIS.
No, it's ISIL. They changed it.
Islamic State in Lebanon?
No, the Islamic land, whatever. But anyway, however you want to call them. Those crazy people over there, they're even killing their own who think different.
They're not Muslims.
They think they are. They're advertising themselves.
It's about like saying that people in Waco
We're Christians. Yes. No, I'm aware of that, but they've even tried to instate the caliphate and everything else following Islamic tradition. But that's my point. They're the crazy ones. They don't just think that all Muslims should be awesome, just them.
Yeah.
Because they're even killing their own kind, let alone what they do to the Christians or whatever other religions are there.
And there is precedent. And actually, again, parallels between the two religions are pretty high. There is precedent in their religion for doing what ISIS is doing. It's horrible. I don't think it's right.
Right, which is why they're usually then calling it a caliphate and all this other stuff.
Yeah. However, same justification actually exists in Torah too.
Right.
About if you have a city that rebels, what do you do with it?
Erase it.
Erase it. So, while these are both supposed to be peaceful religions, people can take very specific examples and use it to do whatever they want.
Right, because even for that, I mean, for as peaceful as Judaism is, they might go to the Wailing Wall, but they have not overrun the Dome of the Rock.
True.
Quite literally, because they feel it would be wrong for that kind of because there's enough Israelis, their cops walk around with M16s on them, walking around the streets of Jerusalem, because that's the way they know how to keep peace.
Yeah.
So what's to prevent 20 Israeli officers from overrunning the Dome of the Rock on a Friday?
Nothing. Nothing really.
Quite literally. They just, the political backlash, because somebody in the UN seems to think that used to be called Palestine for a good reason. That's why I digressed to my own personal opinion.
Yeah. Well, that's that. Yeah. Okay. So, but let's go back to the original topic. Creation. We are getting kind of often involved, but it's there. Okay. So, gone through a whole bunch of different groups. And here's the important thing. All of these sound awfully silly, don't they? I mean, there's an amount of mud that made it. It's because these stories, they sound silly to us because we're not of those religions. They sound silly to us because they're not of the same mindset.
Well, even if you take Genesis 1 through 10 and apply it forward, it sounds silly if you don't have any faith behind it.
See, and I was going to get into that too. Oh, I forgot to cover one more. There's always one group that I always am supposed to cover, just as a counterexample to religion. What do atheists believe for creation?
Big Bang.
Bingo. I mean, it sounds like a simple, silly thing to have to point out, but
okay. For those of us listening at home, would you kindly explain in more sentences what Big Bang Theory is?
The idea that at some point and I'm going to go back to the beginning. At some point, two particles existed somewhere, somehow, something. One of the theories is two particles existed that eventually collided. These two particles, when they collided, created a whole lot of energy.
Nuclear fission?
No. Beyond that. Way beyond that. This is quantum level stuff. And this begins expanding. This ball of energy begins expanding at the speed of light. Actually, potentially faster than what we think of the speed of light is right now, because the rules of physics weren't necessarily even the same at the time period. And this expands. And eventually, and there's a very important set of theories that occurs, you start getting clumps and strings of this stuff forming. Now, before this existed, there was not darkness. There was not lightness. There was not anything. It was literally nothing. No, zip, zero, zilch. There was no existence. Time did not exist. In fact, until those two particles occur, time could not exist until after that. Because there had to be a precipitating event to cause the universe to come to existence, to cause this bang, to cause time to begin even. There was nothing. Zero. Now, of course, where did these two particles come from? Well, more modernly, we've kind of actually gotten rid of this, the idea of the particles that occurred. Instead, there's actually a number of other theories ranging from a single singularity that might have existed because of a previous universe that existed until it finally contracted and squeezed itself down to this one little dot smaller than an atom, and then exploded back out again, which is a cyclic universe theory. There is also the idea whoa, this is the worst drawing of this explanation ever, that in reality, this is one universe out of a multiverse. That the idea that there is more than one thing out there, which actually, there's actually a number of scientific theories that require a multiverse, and even if you're getting into the 14th dimensional math, you need to actually have an omniverse above and beyond that. The idea being that you have black holes and white holes, black holes being where matter and energy from a previous universe are collected and eventually spewed out of a white hole at the other end into a new universe. There is, well, I give you three. That's three examples of some of the possible precipitating events. Because in fact, science will probably never be able to know for sure if and what a precipitating event for it was. It's beyond, literally, when time doesn't exist, we can't measure something. So, a little hard to kind of figure that one out. So anyways, as the universe starts to coagulate, eventually we get to the point, because at this point, everything is white hot, light everywhere, etc., until eventually you get to the point you get all this stuff starting to coagulate. Not into planets, nothing like that, nothing fancy. We're just talking stuff kind of...
Galaxy.
Not even quite that. Yeah, sort of galaxies, but sort of not. Because then at this point, we finally get to the point where it's not so clumped together that we can finally have spots that aren't white hot all the time. We still have a lot of spots that are white hot, but not all of them. And then slowly but surely, as this expands, the universe begins to settle down and calm down. When it settles down and calms down, you end up with stars, planets, galaxies, more what we think of the universe to be.
Space.
Right. The time differential between this dot and the beginning of clumping could be, well, see, I don't know which was the right answer anymore. It used to be there was the talk that it was, literally a matter of a very short time period. Seconds took this to evolve into the very first unstabilized pieces. Because you see, if it was a ball explosion, a regular explosion, then nothing existed. It would be perfectly symmetrical.
Yeah.
But because it's not perfectly symmetrical, something happened in there that caused the first lines, the first little threads, the strings to occur, and caused the first clumping to occur. And that may have happened in the first second, actually the first femtosecond of existence. We don't know, but that's one of the theories. Getting to the point where we classically think of the universe, millions of years, still took a while before it started cooling down to the point that we got to have galaxies, planets, and suns. Took forever. Theoretically 13.4 billion years is the current estimate.
The reason you're in trouble writing is because you're oiled on your hands using the eraser.
Yeah. Plus, it also might be the fact that I might have finally gotten these enough that turned to cause wrong. I don't know. You're probably right.
Sorry, the secretary must preserve the goods.
There, galaxies. So it takes quite a while, millions of years, before we start to see something that resembles what we classically think of the universe.
And they're defining a year by our solar year.
Right, and keep in mind, remember that whole bit I said where physics might have not been actually evidence that physics wasn't the same back there. The constant that we refer to, the speed of light, speed of light is not the constant. The speed of light is expression of the constant. That the constant was different. If the constant was different, then our measure for what time was is different. And if our measure for time was, then we really, can't say that it was really 17 billion years or 12 billion years or 1 billion years ago. It would be almost impossible because if there's any variation in this, it is outside of the scope of what our science can deal with currently. Let's just say the word currently, because we don't really know for sure whether the expression of C had changed. We think it did. We think it may have actually changed as early as 2 point some odd billion years ago. May have been the last time it changed. Based on actually some observations of things that occurred on Earth. So yeah, that whole idea of when the time frames were, yeah, you're right. We're guessing to a certain degree.
Right, and then that comes into the whole thing with dinosaurs and whatnot, and why people like Ken Ham get all bent out of shape about how can you have creation in 6 days, and how dinosaurs were alive for millions of years. So therefore, the dinosaurs must be wrong. There's evidence in Genesis of dinosaurs and unicorns. So, nah.
Well, and I guess one of the questions, because we're at 332 right now, if we start going through the Christian material, we'll never make it 1 by 4. So it's a problem.
We'll do the sum up.
Let's do the sum up. Sure. Okay. Let's do the talk about.
Because this would apply technically to symbol as it has a B.
Okay.
This would apply to any of the creation theories.
Absolutely.
We just think that our God's right, so therefore we dissect it more.
See, because modernly, and I'm going to say this, modern American church tends to teach the idea of literalism. That's not always been the case. American church, however, I should say, it hasn't been the case throughout all of history that it's been about literalism. But America, it's almost, but not quite exclusively, from a pulpit level as a literalist point of view. We can blame some of this, said some, on this one guy. Because Calvin was about the ultimate expression of a literalist in the Bible. When it comes to this is not a story about the Word of God. No. This is the Word of God. Every bit of it is true. No matter what you think, no matter what evidence you have to the opposite, it is absolutely positively true. That is
true and accurate.
True and accurate. Yes, you're right. Because there are no inaccuracies in the Bible, according to Calvin. Which
the English Bible specifically, even because.
Yes, thank you. Because I was trying to figure out how I was going to express that. Yes, he was picking a translation of the Bible that was inaccurate. We know the translation to have been inaccurate. But still, the translation is inaccurate. We will never have an English Bible that the translation is accurate, because we do not speak the language, nor do we have the same cultural references. We will never have it accurate. I will always be wrong because my translations are wrong. There's just no two ways about it. Even if I spoke Hebrew and spoke ancient Hebrew or Proto-Hebrew or going back as far as you can, I would always be wrong because I still don't have the cultural frames of reference that occurred during it. So,
Milk and Honey was not talking about bees.
Yes. So Calvin, put him on the literalism side. The reason why I came to America, very particularly, why the foundation of American faith ends up being literalism a lot of times, is because of the Puritans. They were very much literalists. So were the Quakers, actually, at one time, but that's a different story. They were very much literalists. So when other divisions of Christianity came over, there was always already a foundation that existed. So any new faiths that came over, any new Christian faiths that came over, usually ended up, to a certain degree at least, being influenced by that literalism that already existed here.
One of the most interesting tidbits about the Puritan literalism, there's like the whole huge point in the Scarlet Letter, but some of the fine details, she was told not to wear so much lace because it was not modest. Covered to her chin in fabric, but wearing too much lace was immodest. Lace that she'd made herself. It was considered immodest. Anything that would be showing forth one's abilities. Which, can you imagine how this would work with things that need talent, like doctors?
Or anything that showed individuality, too.
Yes. So just, there's a lot of cultural points that come through that we make the jokes the Pilgrims all looked alike, but, well, they did.
Yeah. By the way, if you want to see the basis for the Borg, it's the Puritans. It's my belief. Basis for the Borg was actually the Puritans, because anybody who joined Puritans...
We will assimilate you.
Anybody who joined the Puritans, you had to become exactly like them. There was no individuality whatsoever.
That's why it didn't work out so well for the Indians.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a group that was like, wait, no, we intentionally make these guys over here a little different than us. Those are warriors. That's why they live over there. They're different than us. Yeah.
Well, because even the quote-unquote praying Indians, that were so nice and called them, weren't good enough because they were still Indians.
Yes.
They would never be blonde.
Yes. Yeah. So now, on the symbolism side, I'm going to get them all.
You spelled that. Yes.
And I'm going to get a moment of, what? Okay, there's a difference between American Catholicism, which is supposed to follow very closely with what the Vatican says, and what the Vatican actually is. The catechism for you. I didn't think I'd ever do this in front at First Key Congregation, but I'm going to actually read a piece out of the Catholic Catechism.
We hope he doesn't burst.
I might. It has been known to happen.
I know where the fire extinguisher.
Thank you very much. Oh, I never did go over the Zoroaster one. That's always a fun one. Here we go. If you'll follow along in your catechism book, and the Catechism of the Catholic Church.
Be specific, not Luther's catechism.
Oh, that's a different story. That's a different story. We only have time for so many stories. And turn to paragraph 283. But the fact that I've got it down to that point, very important.
The fact that they have it down to that point.
What book, what religious writing that is of major size does not have it broke down this way?
Luther's catechism.
That is.
Not the copy I had.
Oh, it's got a concordance, if you want to.
Not the copy I had.
I understand, if you want to.
Okay, I'm just saying.
So, anyways, the question about the origins of the world and of man have been the object of many scientific studies, which have splendidly enriched our knowledge of the age and dimensions of the cosmos, the development of life forms, and the appearance of man. These discoveries invite us even greater admiration for the greatness of the Creator, capital C, prompting us to give Him, not capital by the way, thanks for all His works, for the understanding and wisdom He gives to scholars and researchers. With Solomon, they can say, "It is He who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements, for wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me." That is, that was 284, which the overall reaching idea that we do see knowledge, that's okay, and that is used as evidence that this is actually symbolism. Now, we go one step further though. The great interest recorded of these studies is strongly simulated by a question of another order, which goes beyond the proper domain of the natural sciences. It is not only a question of knowing when and how the universe arose physically, or rather discovering the meaning of such origin. Is the universe governed by chance, blind fate, anonymous necessity, or by a transcendent, intelligent, and good being called God? And if the world does come from God's wisdom and goodness, why is there evil? Where does it come from? Who is responsible for it, and is there any liberation from it? You can really actually kind of ignore that last little bit there to get to the grain of what's being said here. Not only should we question it, not only is this probably just symbolic, because if you accept scientific explanations for it, you're using that to refine the symbolism. The symbolism is why. Why do we exist? Why is it written this way? Why are these things the way they are? That's what they felt the important part was. Why? The science is cool, the science is interesting, the science allows us to look at the stars and go, wow, that's cool, God does cool stuff. But it's not the important questions.
Well, that even falls back into the late Greek philosophers.
So what?
The late Greek philosophers.
Yeah? Why?
Even so much as why existent in this time and place versus 2 towns over, or, why here? Why do I have a dog instead of a cat? Yeah, things like that.
Is there a design to it?
Right, very specific onto the late Greek philosophy.
Yeah. So the Catholics have went along that way. I'm going to throw. This is fun. Because there's been both sides.
Pick a sex to any sex.
Because just like Christianity, it's easy sometimes. When I was growing up, and the reason why I do mention this particular, when I was growing up, we were taught Jews believe one particular thing. All Jews believe the same thing.
Right. Just like all Catholics believe the same thing.
Yeah. So, but it's not. It's not that way. So, in Judaism, as an overall religion, I won't say it has as many fractions and divisions to it as Christianity, which is a larger religion. It has a lot. It has a lot. But when you only got 14 million people following it, you can only split them up so many ways.
You can split them up 14 million ways.
You're correct.
Actually, 7 million ways. Usually, to consider it a sect, you must have at least 2 people who believe you.
Fair point.
You and Bob.
Fair point. So as long as you and Bob, or you and Tina, or whatever, believe the same thing,
it counts as a sect.
Yeah. Both have existed. One of the fascinating conversations I was having, and I wish I had time to stop and go watch this series and find the section that he's talking about, was it was a Jew's Jew. It was a guy who taught at one of the universities in Jerusalem on Judaism, on the history of it. He was a rabbi, etc., etc. This was a guy. And he pointed out more than once on the symbolism side. That's where his belief fell, was on the symbolism side. Did it matter? Does it matter what the order of the Bible was of creation? Yes, but not because of whether or not it was exactly what happened. It was important because this set lessons for us to learn from. For instance, why is it 6 days of creation and 1 day of rest? Well, we have 6. Let's say day means division rather than that. Okay, so when we work 6 divisions, we're supposed to rest on the 7th. When we plow a field for 6 years, on the 7th it's supposed to rest. In fact, so much stuff fell in line with that it was important to explain that everything must rest. everything. If God stopped and rested, then it was important that everybody else stop and rest too. So even if the story, even if it was symbolic, what he pointed out was that it was important that we understand certain precepts, and that this story was to help us understand those precepts. That this is what happened, and this is why you also should rest. Because if it's good enough for God, it's good enough for you. So even the Jews were split on this, though, because some of them knew quite literally, what year is it right now?
5775.
I don't remember.
Right, it's close.
I thought it was.
I can't remember if it was 74, 76, or 75.
But if you follow Judaism, you count since the beginning of creation,
Which happened in the fall.
which happened in the fall on a Tuesday. I believe it was a Tuesday. Which, okay.
It would have had to been on a Monday. The 7 days. You're going to make Saturday the 7th day.
So you're going to drag me into debate that you
Or are
don't
you
want to.
going off of Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah?
I'm going to have to go back and find out why it was a Tuesday. I was amused at the specificness of it. Don't ask me why. I read the explanation. I went, that's kind of funny. Okay, you're making it up.
Well, following the Hebrew calendar in this case.
It should be day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5,
Right.
6, day 7, and
It's not
theoretically.
day 7. It's always Shabbat. There is no whatever.
But you're right. According to the way that the thought should be, day 1 would be Monday.
Right. But no, day 1 is Sunday.
Day 1 is. You're right.
My point was more talking about the holiday cycle. Rosh Hashanah means head of the year. In Hebrew Bible, though, it is Yom Teruah, the day of blowing. And then 10 days later is Yom Kippur, and then a few days after that is the start of Sukkot. Sukkot was when the garden was supposed to be open with Adam and Eve, because God was walking amongst them. So then if Yom Teruah, or Yom Kippur, is when we were covered, then that should be the beginning. So the Hebrew calendar year always starts in the fall versus the Gregorian calendar that starts in the middle of winter, right after the solstice. He has a thought. So in 2,000 years, something is going to happen?
No, that's when the universe was created. According to Archbishop James Usher, it was 22nd of October, 4004 BC.
But then again, when they changed the calendar to the Gregorian calendar, they lost 4 days.
Yeah, don't you think he was?
In October, even.
Don't you think he would compensate for such a thing?
Don't make me hurt you.
Okay, and actually, I like writing this up here for another reason, because we're going to have to sum up very quick. And I have a funny feeling we'll just do this as a part 2. We'll actually pick up on the Christian part next week.
Sure.
And we'll do a part 2. Because there's a whole lot just in the history. Because, and here's the point I'm going to get to, actually. In fact, I'm going to ignore this. We'll come back to that another time. This is the point. Right now, there is a schism idea that symbolism is the bad guys and that literalism are the bad guys. Here in America, if you're on the symbolism side, if you're a church that is on the symbolism side, you are a liberal church. You are the problem. On the other hand, if you're a literalist, You're the problem because you're set in your ways, and obviously, you can't be right.
Right, and then there's people who keep their children at home and homeschool them because you can't learn about dinosaurs.
But also, there's another problem. Those who follow literalism say, no, that's always how it's been. We've always followed this in a very literal fashion. This has always been how it was. Those who follow allegory or symbolism in their thought say, no, this is how it's always been. It's always been a tale, and we've always followed it this way. These two things that aren't right or aren't wrong. There has always been somebody who's fallen on each side. There's always been groups that have fallen on each side. Even when you get into the whole idea of the Pharisees and Sadducees, where one group was following one set of traditions and one group was following not that set of traditions.
Well, and even that being said, you always end up with that one kid. I don't care what group of kids there are. There's that one kid. You told me that I needed to sit still for 5 minutes before I could have a cookie. It's been 5 minutes and 1 second. Where's my cookie? You lied.
Yes.
Or the other little Timmy was like, well, I sat still for 4.5 minutes. Can I still have a cookie? You said 5 minutes. I can't tell time. I hated that when I was in trouble. I couldn't tell time. So this is part of the quote-unquote human condition. Because, like my niece and her wonderful quote, stop talking with your mouth full. There's still room. There's the intent behind it, but there's also then our limited language. And words can really only share so much. And I'm sorry, if I was whoever you want to decide wrote Genesis, I'm trying to write this all down. Hey, wait, hold on, I gotta re-ink my pen. And the guy doesn't quit talking? There's something to be said sometimes the words being so absolutely useless. Because there's immoral has two M's. Oh, important. I don't know. Well, even define important.
Well, no, I'm not going to.
Okay.
You know why?
Rhetorical question for next
Because this is where we're going to start next week. Is it important? And then we're actually going to kick into a lot of the stuff I wanted to kick into about Christianity and how it's dealt with this. Because there's stories we've been told over the years. Let me give you an example. There's a lot of history that we've been told that is wrong. And it's been told on us. Christopher Columbus, first guy who sailed, and part of the reason he sailed was to find India because nobody thought the world was round. That's the story we were told when we were kids, right? Absolutely wrong. He knew the world was round. In fact, modern common thinking at the time was that the world was round. There weren't people thinking the world was flat.
It was the landmass in the world.
Right. Nobody knew the Americas was there. That was the big thing.
That to be said, the Italians and the Spaniards didn't know.
Yes, the Vikings did.
The Vikings did, and so did the Chinese.
Oh, and by the way, those guys that lived there knew it was there too.
Right. Well, I'm just saying there's been Chinese pottery found in China. I'm sorry, that was a dumb statement. Chinese pottery found in California that predates the Spanish being there.
They should, at some point or another, they had landed there.
There was tobacco buried in Russian frozen tombs. Tobacco is indigenous to South America.
Yeah. So there's all these things we've been told. And it still applies to the church. We've been told that the church is absolutely against science, for instance. This has happened. This
because
is
Galileo Galilei got himself killed for it.
Right. Does anybody remember that one of the physicists that created the nuclear bomb, worked with Einstein, was a Catholic priest? He was up here doing his equations on a chalkboard There's a great picture of him and Einstein standing together and he's doing his equations on the chalkboard, and you know what? He has his collar on. So we're told a lot of stuff, and we're going to try and demystify and see if we can find a little more truth out of that.
And there's a lot to be said about what we're told. The concept of learning and self-investigation and your source. Because my mommy is a very intelligent woman. She's great at many things. She also knows that pronunciation of words is not her strong suit, and she can't read the dictionary pronunciation cues. So, until she was corrected, it was Rauchin instead of routine. Tatatita instead of taffeta. Whereas that is one of my total geek out factors, is reading the dictionary to make sure I'm saying it right. So there's just a lot to be said about what you've been told versus what you can find for your own resources. And also what is popular is not always right, and vice versa. Because I can find you 7 sources that say that dinosaurs were a made up thing.
Yes.
Written down, published, with peer review. That doesn't mean they're right.
Well, okay. Now you have to be careful of that word peer review.
Right.
Who was the peer?
Right. The same crackpots. 7 people reviewed each other's work does not make it a true thing.
So anyways, next week we'll get into why is it important, and why, if it is, why? Why is this such a big deal? Why is this such a huge question? Why do we actually, in modern times, have a schism occurring over it? And we're going to talk about the techniques that some people have used on each side. Why do some people think that it is literalist and some people think that it's allegory? And the proofs that they've used behind it. So, anyways, we're out of time. So, I'll see you guys next week. Bye.